Dr. Kathleen Creel from Northeastern University. She's co-appointed in philosophy and computer science there. She got her PhD at the University of Pittsburgh and then did a postdoc at Stanford, so she comes to us by a chain of very great places. And she works in philosophy of machine learning, ethics of artificial intelligence, and general philosophy of science. And today she's going to talk to us about fairness and randomness in predictive systems.
I realized we should have said Zoom first.
Can everyone on Zoom hear me? Zoom friends? We don't know. Okay, we'll never know.
Your box is green, which suggests yes.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming to my talk, and thanks to Zoe for the generous introduction, and to Zoe and Michelle for inviting me. I've had a wonderful day, and I'm hoping to talk with a lot more of you great people. So today I'm going to talk about fairness and randomness in predictive systems. And this is drawing on a bunch of co-authored work with my wonderful collaborators, so I want to thank them. And their little heads will be popping up on the talks, on the slides, so you will see all of these warm and round faces again. Okay, so imagine, as some of us face every year, we have hundreds or thousands of resumes, and out of this giant stack of people, we want to find 3 to interview and 1 to hire. So from a computer science point of view, this is a constrained optimization problem. We have time constraints. We don't want to devote our whole lives to this. We have information constraints. There are only some things that we're told about the candidates. Even in a more unbounded space, we have privacy constraints. There are some things we're not allowed to know about the candidates. And perhaps most importantly, the feature space is very underdefined. So it's not clear what makes a candidate good right now, and it's certainly not clear what will make a candidate good in the future as conditions change. So in this very muddy problem comes automated hiring systems. And automated hiring systems purport to help us with this problem. And the way they work is that most systems will screen whatever initial applications candidates send and discard about half of the applications before a human ever sees them. For legal reasons, it is possible for the hiring manager to find those files again. They're not gone. But practically, it's not that common that people would go into that bottom 50% pool and retrieve people. And this is very common. Most Fortune 500 companies use some degree of automated hiring. And the hope is that this will save time, reduce bias, and produce more consistent judgments. And it's this final point that I want to focus on, the consistency of the judgments. So imagine this now from the candidate perspective. So imagine you're applying to 3 what I hope are New Brunswick area grocery stores, the Aldi, the Bravo, and the Food Town. I don't know which one of these are good, but Food Town is the best name. So you've applied to all of these places, and you perhaps naively assume that at each of these places, which are separate fiscal entities, that different individuals will be looking at your files. And for most of the past, that would have been true. But now it might be the case that all 3 of these companies have contracted with the same provider of hiring algorithms. And so what we see here is standardization. Previously, there were many separate sources of decision making, and now there's one. So we have this setup in which automated decision making systems are standardizing by potentially enforcing the same classification on the same token applicant file every time it's encountered at scale. So in past work with a legal scholar, we focused on the sense in which this is arbitrary, and in that sense unfair to candidates. But now I want to focus on the standardization. So I think the scenario I've sketched is not unreasonable, because the largest algorithmic hiring provider has clients including 60% of the Fortune 100 and 8 of the 8 largest 10 federal agencies. So it's very possible that as a candidate, you will encounter the same provider multiple times. And the reason that I think this is a philosophically interesting problem is that standardization at scale is one of the few features of automated decision making that seems meaningfully different from human decision making. So as people in this room probably know better than I do, human decision-making is very variable. Even when we give people who are trained, whose whole job it is to make decisions, like doctors, judges, where the main qualification of their work is that they're given some kind of information and they're supposed to make a judgment about it, if you give them the same file 3 months later with names and other minor details changed, they'll often deliver a different judgment about 30% of the time. So if even the same person would give potentially a different judgment about the same file over time, you can imagine the sources of intrapersonal variation in judgments that people are giving about the same file. Whereas if we have the same algorithm and we have the same input and that algorithm is deterministic, we're going to get the same output. So I think this is a case where algorithmic and human decision-making might have importantly different features rather than one just sort of exacerbating patterns present in the other. So I'm going to talk about what standardizes algorithmic decisions, when should we consider this standardization a problem, and when it is a problem, what should be done. So first, what standardizes algorithmic decisions? The first thing, of course, would just be the basic nature of an algorithm. And I won't spend any time on this in this room, but if we have, let's say, Donald Knuth's definition of an algorithm, we think of it as something that produces outputs that have a specified relationship to the inputs. And if our algorithm is deterministic, that will be a relationship of sameness. But we can also think on this broader scale about algorithmic monoculture. So when we think about monocultures of crops, we think about cases where we've traded efficiency for some kind of medium-term diversity or soil health. So we have a monoculture of crops. It's much easier for us to harvest it using the same machines as opposed to having different kinds of crops. We can fertilize it in the same way. We've made things a lot easier for ourselves, but we might over-deplete the soil, and there might be sort of an ecosystem collapse in the longer term. And similarly, by analogy, we can think about algorithmic monoculture as the state in which many decision makers in some kind of ecosystem are all relying on the same algorithm. And Kleinberg and Raghavan have suggested also by analogy, but in a formal model that they run, that we can see similar medium-term collapse dynamics, where if everyone is using the same algorithm for a hiring task, they might fail to learn about different kinds of candidates, fail to respond to changing market conditions, and so fail to be able to prepare for the next step in a way that they might if there was a greater diversity of hiring algorithms within the ecosystem. So we're going to relax this definition a little bit because we think it's more realistic. So instead of thinking just about the case where everyone is relying on the exact same algorithm, we're going to think about the case where there's a little more diversity. So maybe these houses are very similar, but clearly built on the same plan, but they have different colored doors, and they have awnings, and some of them have a car and some of them don't. So along this model, we're going to think about relaxed algorithm monoculture as the case where many decision makers rely on similar, and I promise to specify similar in what way, algorithms. So imagine HireVue now builds some kind of screening algorithm for grocery stores, but they adapt it slightly for each of the grocery stores. So they're measuring the same things, they're using the same features, but maybe they say, we will train it on your top 50 best employees to make it special for you. And so there is some adaptation that makes these algorithms slightly different from each other. So now we're thinking about this case where we have HireVue 1, 2, 3, or we're even willing to relax it to say, if we have a different provider of hiring algorithms, but perhaps one that uses similar data, we can think about that as a potential algorithmic monoculture. So in that relaxed setting, what would standardize algorithmic decision making? So now let's think about more systematic sources of similarity across algorithmic decision making in a domain. So of course we have, it could be similar because it's exactly the same, but we also have standardization due to shared components. So this is what we call, unimaginatively, the component sharing hypothesis. So the hypothesis here is that the more that algorithms are trained on the same data sets, and so trying to recover the same statistical patterns, the more that they're relying on the same models, underlying models, relying on the same libraries, and trying to hit the same evaluations, the more likely their outcomes are to be similar. So we saw this, for example, in the case of data sets when a lot of computer vision models trained on ImageNet. So for a while, ImageNet was a data set that was considered to be the best game in town. It was the largest source of labeled images. And so a lot of different teams, groups, efforts would train on ImageNet. But in doing so, they standardized errors. So it was very common for ImageNet models to have not just mistakes, all models make mistakes, but the same kinds of mistakes. And those kinds of mistakes were reliance on spurious cues and background textures as shortcuts. So here, the task is to predict the foreground object, which on the left is supposed to be a fox squirrel, and on the right is a dragonfly. But a lot of ImageNet models would say that the left image was a sea lion, and the right image was a manhole cover. So it's not just that they're making a mistake, it's that they're making the same mistake. And so look at it for a second and think about, why do you think that is? So the proposal is that it's because of the texture. So here we have the texture of the wet rock is very similar to the texture of a sea lion, and the cross-hatching of the patio chair that the dragonfly is on is very similar to the cross-hatching of a standard US manhole cover. So again, every system makes mistakes, but training on the data set can lead to making the same particular mistakes. And there are a lot of domains that don't have very many good publicly available data sets. So now there are a lot more image data sets. It's not quite the same. But imagine you were trying to get data about the entire internet. Well, there's only one entire internet. So we can scrape it better or worse, we can clean it better or worse, but we can't get an equally large data set that is a different entire internet, because we're all converging on the same source of data. And likewise, we can even have standardization from epistemic quality. So if a lot of effort has been put into curating some kind of data set, and then a lot of teams use it, that may be good for a lot of reasons, but it will also mean that a lot of teams are converging on using this data set. We could also imagine large models as a source of potential standardization. So think about foundation models as large models that are trained using significant resources. And I don't know about you, but if I trained a $10 million model, I would try to use it a couple times before throwing it in the trash, at least. So the whole point is that these models will be the bottlenecks to a whole bunch of different tasks that will all rely on the same model. We create the models in order to use them for many, many, many purposes. But that means that single model has the potential to create a single point of failure. So with some co-authors, we tried to measure whether that was true. I'm trying to do this new thing as a philosopher where I assert things and then also investigate whether they're the case. Many of you in this room are also interested in this activity. So we said, okay, we've been saying that these act as hubs or bottlenecks, but is that actually true? So if we imagine these different parts in the training pipeline, we can create a big graph that models the relationships between data creation, data curation, training on different data sets, and then adapting trained models for different purposes, and then relying on adapted models for different deployed tasks. So what we saw is that there are these hubs where a lot of different stages at individuals at one stage will rely on the same thing from a previous stage. So here you see the pile, which is a high quality data set. You see a lot of different models that are all relying on the pile. So that is now a hub that could be a source of standardization. We can also see model hubs. Here are a lot of different models that are relying on Palm. And then of course we can see API hubs. So here's the OpenAI hub. This is now a very small proper subset of all the models that rely on OpenAI. But we can think of these hubs as algorithmic monocultures. So if there's some kind of feature of a current OpenAI model and a whole bunch of products are relying on it, like Slack, Spotify, Instacart, whatever is true of that model, good or bad, has the potential to flow downstream. And some people have pointed to this as a potential source of monoculture. So the SEC's Gary Gensler has been very concerned about this and has said, foundation models could be a concentrated risk if too many people rely on them. Okay, so those are some potential sources of standardization for algorithmic decisions. Now let's think about, if this were true, if it's the case that monocultures can standardize decisions, how would we measure that? How would we know whether that's happening? So let's think about the setting where we have different individuals and they're interacting with deployed machine learning systems of some kind. And let's say it's a case where there's some kind of decision, and so they're receiving outcomes, or they're receiving services perhaps that can have better or worse quality. So we're going to say that an individual receives outcomes from different decision makers, and then they experience a systemic failure if the decision fails for every decision maker in that ecosystem on that individual person. And likewise, in a classification setting, if it misclassifies, every decision-making system misclassifies that person. So we standardized this in a recent NeurIPS paper and said, okay, let's just first count, does every model fail for this individual? That's easy. But then it would be too simple to just do that because each of these models has an error rate. And so if all the models are pretty bad, they would naturally have a large collision of errors on individuals, but just because there are a lot of errors. So what we actually want to know is, are the errors colliding on individuals more than we would have expected just merely based on the error rate? And so we want to normalize by the expected rate of systemic failure, which we're going to base on independence. And then we go on to analyze, is this happening in some real-world systems that we have access to? So what we find is, if we look, for example, at APIs, so this is where there are a bunch of commercial APIs, and there's a really nice data set where we can see for image, text, and speech, and for 3 different APIs, how common is it for those APIs to make mistakes on the same samples? And what we find is that they are much more homogeneous than we would have expected. So here, this is the 0 models correct case, and the light blue is what we would have expected if the errors were independent, and the dark blue is what we actually observe. And likewise, 3 is all models correct. Again, the observed dark blue is much higher than the expected light blue. Okay, so when I give this talk to computer scientists, what we often say is, well, that makes total sense because those samples are just hard. And I say, well, what is it to be hard? And they say, well, hardness is when everyone makes a mistake on you. And I'm like, well, that I agree with. But is there a model-independent sense of hard? Are these hard in some more well-grounded sense? Because oftentimes when we look at these samples, they don't look to us as observers to be harder. And indeed, if you have humans do this task, it's not clear that these samples are harder for us than other samples that all models get correct. So there is a property of hardness, but it's relative to these particular features of the system. And I would say that's exactly one of the things we're trying to get at with monoculture, is that these systems are similar to each other in a way such that there are things that are hard for that type of system, not hard simpliciter. Okay, so building on this property of hardness, we see that model improvements over time don't reduce these systemic failures. So when we look at what's improved over time, this is now just improvements, so things that previously the systems couldn't get correct that now they can get correct. Again, we see that out of all the potential improvements, which is the dark blue, the light blue, the dark blue is what actually improves, and so we massively under-improve on the samples that all systems were previously bad at. This is just another way of visualizing that. Okay, so we have ways now to measure the sense in which algorithmic monocultures can homogenize outcomes. We can say, do they concentrate their mistakes on the same individuals, the same samples, the same tasks, the same questions. And we can measure that. But now we turn to the ethical part of the talk, which is, when should we consider this to be a problem? So just to set up the sort of foil here, what we would want to address is a lot of the things that I've described, the standardizing moves, are epistemically good things. So we might say, if there is a model that's better than other models, yeah, each individual person or decision maker has a reason to choose that model over others. So it's rational, it's maybe even good if each individual person or decision maker or entity will pick the best available model. Now, of course, I'm pointing to the consequence that that means everyone is then picking the same model. And the same thing with every part of the pipeline. So if there's a best available data set, everyone should use it. If there's a best available collection of multiple data sets, everyone should try to get all of them. So we have this question: if standardizing architectures, data sets, models, downstream adaptations, if all of these things actually improve decision quality, improve accuracy, when, given all of that, should we think that homogenization is of moral concern? So that's the question that I'm going to try to answer in the second half of the talk. Okay, so in the second half of the talk, we are now thinking about the people who have lost out as a result of this standardization. So they are the people on whom errors are frequently made. They are the people who are not able to use popular services. They are the few, the unlucky. So when those people experience systemic failures or systemic exclusion, should we think of that as unfair or a form of bias? So my first claim is that we often think in ethics of AI about problems first in terms of whether it's a form of bias or discrimination. I think this is not the right lens for the unique harm of algorithmic exclusion. Because when we think about bias and discrimination, typically we're thinking about something with some kind of historical lineage or with pretty severe outcomes. So some standard definitions are the perpetual subordination of specially disadvantaged groups whose political power is severely circumscribed. So there, we would need to show something about political power. We would need to show something about the duration of this exclusion. Neither of those do we automatically get just from the fact that someone is excluded from some system. We could also think about perceived group membership. So maybe discrimination consists of actions, practices, policies that are based on a perceived group, social group to which those discriminated against belong. And those groups must be socially salient. They must structure interaction in important social contexts. Okay, so it could be that one of the features that is going into causing some individual to be experiencing systemic exclusion is membership in a salient social group. And in that case, then we are going to run our bias story. Then we're going to say, yes, this is probably, we should at least investigate whether this is about bias. But if the individual in question, it doesn't seem like this is happening to them because of some kind of group membership, that doesn't seem like it's a natural explanation to explain it in terms of bias. Or we could think about whether this action sort of compounds a prior injustice. But there again, we would have to trace this historical lineage. What was the injustice that happened in the past, and how does it relate to this current decision-making system? So just to kind of animate this a little bit, let's think about two different types of biases in large models. So we have sort of like traditional group-based biases. So if you asked, this is now an older model, but ChatGPT, to complete a story about members of different religious organizations walking into a bar. So 3 Buddhists walk into a bar. It is what happens. Finish the story. It's much less common for Buddhists, atheists, Jews, and Sikhs for that completion to include something about violence than if it says 3 Muslims walk into a bar. So So that's the kind of group-based bias in these story generations that we might be able to point to and say, there's some kind of disparity here, it has a connection with historical socially salient groups that have been marginalized. We could also think about biases in image. So for example, there's a task called image labeling. So we might say, of these two different labels for this image, which one is more likely? Is it more likely that this person this is a portrait of an astronaut with an American flag? Or is it more likely that this is a smiling housewife in an orange jumpsuit with the American flag? So as human observers, we look at this and we say, man, this is the standard NASA photo setup. There's a giant spaceship in the background. There's a giant helmet. There's a patch. You know, again, she's wearing a spacesuit. Like, seems like a lot of astronaut clues. But no, models will tend to say this is a smiling housewife in an orange jumpsuit with the American flag. That's the salient part. Okay, so we have these standard sort of group-based biases that seem clearly connected to this historical lineage. But we can also think about much weirder artifacts that occur in large models. So one is called name artifacts. So if you look at names with negative sentiment in well-known models, you'll notice that a lot of these relate to recent US political contests. So we have Bernie, we have Donald, we have Hillary. Have you heard of these people? We have Barack, we have Rudy, we have Bill, we have Marco. So all of these people are people that people on Reddit hate. So Reddit is often a big source of training data for large models because there's just so much text. And people on Reddit love to say, I hate Bernie, I hate Bill, I hate Chuck, I hate Barack, whatever. So they are expressing a lot of negative sentiment about these names. And so there come to be negative associations with these names. So we might ask, even in a case where there is no overall bias in the model against, let's say, white male names in general, what if there is a particular bias against Donalds? What if being named Donald causes your resume to lose 0.02 points in a way that might drop you just below some kind of threshold? Is it unfair to Donalds, Bernies, Bills, Kevins, if their name artifacts cause some kind of negative consequences, is that unfair to concentrate those errors on them? And that's just a particular sort of like fun motivation. We could also imagine that there are much weirder and harder to inspect minor consequences that might particularly locate on an individual's file, causing it to be harder for them to get some kind of job. So my contention is that on almost all accounts of group-based bias, there is no group-based bias against Donalds. It doesn't rise to the level of salience mentioned earlier. Now, there are a couple accounts according to which this might be a bias. So Helen Nitzenbaum and Batya Friedman, who are sort of canonical bias and computational systems people, have a very permissive definition of bias, where they say bias is when computer systems systematically and unfairly discriminate. And I think here you want to hear that more in the computer science sense of just separating certain individuals or groups in favor of others. And what is it to be unfair? Well, it's just assigning this bad outcome on grounds that are unreasonable or inappropriate. Okay, so then we kind of get to decide what's unreasonable or inappropriate. And so you can see a world where someone says, yeah, it's unreasonable or inappropriate to bump Donalds down. That seems inappropriate. But you could also imagine someone saying, hey, this kind of overly permissive definition of bias, that's fairness gerrymandering. We can't just pick out everyone who there happened to be a mistake on and say it was unfair to them after we already know the people on whom mistakes were made. That might be overfitting the fairness constraint. So that would be sort of the Kearns and Roth rejoinder. Okay, so yeah, we can't point to this little blue dot that's lost in the bottom of this slope and say, oh, it was unfair to them, if we didn't already have this story about why we expected that group to be the socially salient recipient of discrimination. So you can imagine different possible responses at this point. You could say, well, I care about systemic exclusion, I care about this sort of individual-based harm, but only when we're talking about groups that are already facing social bias. So let's say there's some kind of bias that's group-based, where different groups are receiving the outcome at different rates. Then we could imagine systemic exclusion stacking on top of that. So it's not exactly that people from this group are experiencing worse outcomes, although it might appear that way in our initial survey. It might be that just Jamal is never receiving a good outcome, and he is sort of what is causing the difference between these two groups. So we might say, well, I do care about it in that case, but primarily because I care about bias, and this is just a special weird version of that. Or you could say, perhaps, it matters for excluded individuals because it's a kind of bias. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to say it matters for excluded individuals, but not because it's a kind of bias, but for a different reason. I want to pursue this in part because I agree with it, but also because I think it's the stronger argumentative move. If you can show that it matters for excluded individuals, whether or not they're subject to bias, then necessarily we also care when they're also subject to bias. Okay, so that leaves us with, when is systemic exclusion of individuals because of an algorithmic monoculture wrong? So I really wanted to be able to say it's wrong because it's unjust. So this would be drawing on kind of a political philosophy story where we talk about how we all want to make decisions together, what are the principles of justice that animate that, and that's how we tell the story. And if one of you in the audience has a view about how to do this, I want to hear it, but let me walk you through what I did and why I think it doesn't work. So first, we might turn to something like a principle of democratic equality. So we might say, hey, you know what? It's fine to rank people. It's fine to prefer some job candidates over others. It's fine to give people some good stuff and not other people. We are absolutely allowed to do that. We're even allowed to do that for arbitrary reasons. So if you're running some kind of a, small town hardware store and you just want to hire everyone who likes to fish because you want to talk about fishing with them, you know what? You're allowed to do that as long as it doesn't seem like it has any underlying pattern of certain protected categories that you're not hiring. But if the same hierarchy or ranking is used across an entire sector, so if all hardware stores everywhere use that same ranking, or if it's used across some kind of geographic territory where no one in the state of New Jersey was willing to hire anyone who didn't like to talk about fishing, then we might say, hey, wait a second. Now this is setting the rules of interaction within this whole domain, and that's a kind of monopoly on access to opportunities that we typically reserve for the state. So we don't let individual people set up these monopolies of opportunity unless we've agreed that there's some social purpose for them. And so if we're consistently excluding the same people, we can get this pernicious social hierarchy where the same individuals always fall at the bottom of this hierarchy of esteem. Other people don't have respect for them, they don't esteem them, they don't value their social contributions, and that is unjust. Okay, so this sad cat is here because both because this would be very sad if there was a pernicious social hierarchy of esteem, but also because I don't think this will help us with our systemic exclusion story. And the reason I don't think it helps us is that things have to be really bad before you fall to the bottom of a hierarchy of esteem. So it can't just be the case that you're excluded, for example, from all finance jobs because all finance jobs use Pymetrics. This is mostly true, by the way. So it can't just be like, oh, Pymetrics algorithms hates me and so I can't get a finance job, but I can still get other kinds of jobs. Okay, well then you're not at the bottom of the social hierarchy of esteem. You haven't been excluded from all opportunities within this sector of employment. You can still get other jobs. Okay, so this threshold wouldn't support action on most empirically demonstrated cases of homogenization that we have found. Now you can take that on one of two ways, of course. You could say, that's great, that means we never have to care about systemic exclusion. Sorry, Donalds. Or you could say, okay, so that means there's something about this story that hasn't yet picked out the wrong-making features of systemic exclusion. So let's try a different sort of like sectors of opportunity story. So here there's this philosopher named Walzer who says there are different spheres of justice, And these spheres should be uncorrelated. So no one should be precluded from getting some kind of social good in one sphere because they lack a different social good. So if I have a bad credit score, that shouldn't in and of itself stop me from getting healthcare. Okay, so the reason I picked credit score instead of his other examples is that credit score is like kind of an abstract good, right? It's not in and of itself a material benefit to you. So we could say maybe algorithmic legibility, your ability to be correctly judged by an algorithm or a particular type of algorithm, shouldn't then directly throttle whether you can access employment, welfare, healthcare, other unrelated kinds of goods. But notice that this threshold, again, you have to be shut out of all the things within that sector, and that's like a really strong barrier. We could also talk about this in terms of harm to autonomy. So if exclusion stops you from being able to choose between different life paths, that might rise to the level of it being a problem. And so here we can say, look, if you're excluded from one opportunity, not a big deal, that happens to everybody, but there's some threshold at which it becomes a barrier to you being able to choose among different coherent life paths, and that's part of how you exercise your autonomy, so that's when it becomes a harm to you. But again, this would have to shut you out of so many different opportunities that you would no longer be able to choose between life paths. That's a pretty high threshold. So I want to propose instead that we take a more contractualistic framework. So instead we say, okay, let's say we didn't have these algorithms, let's say we were starting from scratch, and we were all considering some kind of set of rules or decision principles that we wanted to adopt about how it was appropriate to consider people for hiring or whatever. What decision principles are acceptable? So what Scanlon says is that decision-making principle is acceptable if no one affected might reasonably reject it. Now, philosophers have this big red word, reason, that we like to hit people with. So what does it mean to reasonably reject something? So let's find out what's in that big red hammer. Well, it turns out that a rejection is reasonable when there's some kind of burden that was previously imposed on the person who's trying to do the rejection, and then there's some alternative principle that we could switch to that doesn't have greater burdens on other people. So this is kind of supposed to rule out the NIMBY case, right? So it can't be like, oh, I don't want the cell tower in my backyard, so I'm going to reject it, but then it's going to go to someone else's backyard where it's an equal burden to them. It has to be some unique reason why the cell tower is worse for me than it would be for other people's, for me to be able to reject this cell tower, if the cell tower was something that we all kind of like decided was important for this town. So we have this idea that a contractualist can reject some kind of decision principle where the well-being of the same group is consistently sacrificed for the greater good. Okay, that sounds kind of like the case we have here, right? We have this same small group who are getting systemic rejections, and we want to figure out how can we help them by selecting a different principle. So one thing that this literature proposes is that we could instead accept a lottery where we have different randomly selected groups in different encounters. And so what I want to propose is that we should take that and run with it and think about addressing this homogenized outcomes that concentrates errors on particular people by distributing the errors across more people. So we have this rejection of outcome homogenization and heterogeneity of error instead. So how do we actually do that? Now we are at the what is to be done section of the talk. So we started off with this concern that maybe everyone was epistemically correct in picking these good models and flocking to the same models. But it turns out that was maybe an oversimplification, because many models have the same accuracy while having different predictions. So we can look at these sort of stylized images as a way to visualize this. So here in the not very good classifier, we're trying to divide red from blue points. Our classification line is doing the dividing. Both of these have 74% accuracy, but they have 10% different affected points. So we have equal accuracy models, but different points that we're wrong on. But we can still do that even with our 92% accurate model. So we can have 92% accuracy, but 16% points that are different between these two different models. So this is relying on a phenomenon known as model multiplicity, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. And from a sort of philosophical point of view, we can think about this as if our original model is the model that we're starting with, we can say, hey, I'm willing to explore the same accuracy model class. So what are all the different models that would have had the same accuracy for this decision problem? Or equivalent accuracy. Maybe I don't need to have this exact decimal point. Maybe I'm willing to give up 0.01% accuracy to get different models. And all of those will still be a pretty small subset of the class of all possible models that I could have had. So now we're in the world where we're choosing among these equal accuracy models. So we have different models with different token outcomes. And so we can imagine a world where we have 100 candidates and 10 of them are actually qualified, and our first model gets 9 out of the 10, good for the model, 90% accuracy, but unfortunately it rejects Anna. Well, but we have a different model, an equal accuracy model, that still gets 9 out of the 10, but rejects Joseph. So now we have two models, each of which makes a mistake on a different person, but has equal accuracy. How do we get these models? Where we can act as if we were going to train a random classifier ensemble and get a bunch of models, try to pull them apart, make them as different as possible from each other, and rely on this underlying phenomenon of predictive multiplicity. But then instead of joining their predictions to try to eke out every milli prediction of accuracy that we possibly can, we're going to keep them separate, and we're going to choose between the different models, either for each of these different decision makers, or we're going to give all the models to all the decision makers and let them randomize. So every time we make some kind of a decision, we, under the hood, there's a randomization procedure that's choosing which of the models am I actually going to use to make this decision. And so if Anna applies to the same system twice, one time she might get an interview, and the other time she might not. Okay, so I thought that was really cool. And then I explained it to my stats co-authors, and they were like, that sounds really complicated. Really what you should do is just take the uncertainty that having multiple models had already surfaced and just randomize within the band of uncertainty for each prediction. And I was like, well, that is the same, but mine sounded a lot cooler. So imagine we instead did this much simpler but potentially less cool thing. So one way we could do that would be to say, hey, there's already some points that our model is not sure about. So our model has different confidence in different of its predictions. So maybe those are the points we should flip. So we should identify which things were we already not that sure about, and then every time we make a decision, we should flip a Bernoulli coin and just randomize those predictions. And it turns out, as you would have kind of expected, that the model is more uncertain about points closer to the threshold. So I think this makes some intuitive sense. If there's a 49% candidate, I wouldn't be that confident that that person was not a 51% candidate. But if someone is a 10% candidate, either I'm pretty confident, and so I'm probably not going to flip them, or there's some other reason that I know that I don't know a lot about that kind of candidate. And then I might be quite uncertain about them, and I might still be willing to flip them, even though they're pretty far from the decision boundary. So this is kind of a nice solution, perhaps, because depending on how many of the points we flip, we don't have to lose a lot of accuracy, but we can immediately lose a lot of outcome homogenization just by flipping these uncertain points. So, in summary, shared algorithms, shared data, shared foundation models can all create or contribute to an algorithmic monoculture. This monoculture can homogenize the outcomes of decision tasks. So we created a metric for this, and we also measured it in real data sets. And from an ethical point of view, I think we should consider this to be a problem when it concentrates unreasonable burden of errors or consistent rejections on individuals compared to other possible models. And to address it, each actor in the ecosystem is responsible for randomizing their predictions, beginning with their most uncertain predictions. So my hope is that we can go from this algorithmic monoculture to a beautiful field of wildflowers. Thank you.
everyone. Let's start out with some grad student or postdoc questions, if there are any. Okay, everyone raise your hand if you have a question. Mimi, start us off.
Okay, so this is probably pretty naive. So if I were going to train my kids to self-sort their labels, right, I would give them feedback. The yellows will be yellows, the blues will be blues.
If you're going to train what?
I'm going to train my kids to like sort labels, right?
Yep.
So, the blues go together, the yellow goes together, or the pointy things go together. So with these algorithms, what's the usual training point, right? Are you training them to pick up people or objects, right? So where do the mistakes happen? Is it in the initial instruction set, or just when you let the model just go?
Yeah, good question. So I think there are a few different maybe sources of error, and tell me if this is not the question you're asking. So one of them would be when your kids are learning this task, there's one primary axis of sorting that you're trying to teach them, namely color. You're trying to teach them to distinguish based on color. But in some of these tasks, we might have 100 features. And so part of the problem is like, which of those, part of the learning task is which of those features are actually, should be weighted highly in distinguishing between candidates for this task, and which ones are not important and shouldn't have that much weight. So it might be that some of the source of variation is that we don't have enough data to like really learn a good classifier for this task because there are so many potential features. And then in the more like cases where there are ground truth, like we're trying to convert speech into a transcript or something like that. I think there's an interesting research question there. When I talked to someone about this, Dan Jarafsky, he was kind of like, well, there's just always been this problem, the sheep and the goats. You know, there are some things that are harder than others in a way that sort of like resists classification. But I suspect there's something about those files or those tasks that maybe are just more different from the samples that we're trained on. So sometimes the people in the speech samples have a regional accent that I think, again, everyone in this room would be able to understand, but maybe is just a different accent from other samples in the data set that the models were trained on. So those might be some of the sources of variation.
And,
Sorry, you can follow up.
okay, so this is basic. So on the idea is that these models are running out of things to train on. Is that really true? This is what like I heard like in podcasts and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it could be that I think that would not be true at that level of generality, but I wonder if what people were saying in that context was there is a value in having, for large language models in particular, in having a large source of data of text that was generated by humans. And a lot of the text that has already been digitized is already part of these models. Including like the Toronto Books corpus, which has like a lot of digitized books. So it's expensive to get more text. And then there's a cutoff point at which the new text produced on the internet, some significant fraction of it starts to be auto-generated itself, which isn't considered as good for learning because it's sort of like over-learning what you already learned in virtue of having learned what you did to produce that text. So that might have been what they were thinking about.
Matt?
I wanted to maybe go one step further into the kind of policy domain, and at least in as much as it sort of intersects with the kinds of recommendations that you're proposing and just landscape. So like one of the leverages that we have when approaching algorithmic decision making in terms of bias is that there already are strong protections around decisions regarding protected categories in the law. And one of the things that is interesting by comparison is that sort of, it's not even clear that existing antitrust regulation can be applied to the monopoly hiring power of individual large, not a very employer, we're only making one decision about the candidate anyway. So can you just sort of like expand about like what do we want to do to have a fair world besides just pointing at the map and saying, see, we could do it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think you're right to point to policy. When I first started working on this, I was very optimistic and full of joy. And I said, this seems like a clear market inefficiency. If companies know that they're overlooking these good candidates, they would want to seek them out. And then a labor economist pointed out to me, well, first of all, that argument also holds true for bias, and it's clear that people have not been fully moved to resolve the labor market inefficiencies of their biases. But even more so, in this particular case, you might think that although it's a less concentrated and prevalent harm, it might be even harder to resolve, because you could imagine a company in the bias case saying, hey, I have a really strong mental model of what my biased competitors are doing, and so I'm going to get this competitive advantage by being anti-correlated to that. But that's because they know exactly the factors that other companies might be biased on. So in this case, if you can't find these supposedly good candidates because you don't have the kind of data that would allow you to surface them, that means your competitors also don't have that data that would allow you to surface them. So either you have to gather a lot more expensive data that will somehow allow you to find these people, or you can just rest easy at night knowing that your competitors also can't find them, so no problem. So I think you're right that the strategy might have to be a bit more on the regulatory side. So one of the hooks that I'm interested in is the idea that in sort of like neo-Brandeisian antitrust law, we might have this idea that it's not just that we might care about antitrust because of effects on the consumers who are purchasing products. We also might have some independent interest in what Brandeis calls independent centers of decision making. And so we might have some interest in saying there should be some kind of firewall between the forward-looking business decisions of different companies that might prevent them from all using the same decision making on the back end. Now, I don't think this would be like, oh, no companies can now use SaaS third-party software. I think this would be more like it's a pretty common practice for, let's say you're a large algorithmic hiring provider and you want to hire for a type of employee that most companies don't have a large number of, like IT professionals, so people who fix computers within the company. So you might say, I'm going to create a normal decision-making model for IT professionals, and I'm going to just have one, and I'm going to train it on all the IT professionals of all the different companies. Well, now you're pooling information from all these different companies to create one model that you're now shipping back out to each of the different companies. But importantly, it has proprietary information from each of their competitors, namely the qualities that are true about their private employee. I don't know that this is illegal, but I think there is some question about data sharing behind the scenes that could be a potential regulatory hook. I think you could also imagine a case where there might be a more supply side solution. So NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has some interest in producing things like certified models. Like we can tell you that this model is not biased, or something like that, for this particular definition of bias. So if NIST were doing some kind of more positive program that was like, hey, we can offer something to you, there might be some intervention there that's like, well, maybe it shouldn't be exactly one model. Maybe it should be a family of models. Maybe it should be a model that has some randomization built into it. But I agree with you that there aren't a lot of strong legal hooks for this exact phenomenon that I have found at this time.
John?
Oh, well, I was going to ask the market inefficiency question, so you've kind of already anticipated my question. But let me see if I can put a slightly different spin on it. So, I was thinking of of Moneyball, right? If Major League Baseball all adopts the same algorithm for selecting players, of course you can win better than you might expect by finding, building yourself a team full of Donalds and Bernies. And so you already addressed some sense of why those market incentives might not be sufficient. But I was wondering if you think maybe having some of these companies were to offer a second product, right? For a premium subscription, you can get the stripped down model that's the long shot, take a gamble kind of hires that were based on a subset of our data or something like that. Trying to get something that would be a market rather than regulatory solution. Do you have any reason to think something like that maybe might be effective?
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea. So the idea would be, normally these companies operate in a particular way. Maybe they're training, they have this list of features that they care about, and they're training some kind of model that will just predict which employees are going to be good based on those features. But yeah, you could say, hey, what if you want to take a long shot? What if you want to take some bets? What if you want to be part, perhaps for your own purposes, but maybe also for ours, of this learning cycle where we try to learn about candidates that we're just very uncertain about, because maybe some of them are great, and that will completely pay off your investment in hiring the less great candidates. Yeah, I think that would be interesting. I haven't actually seen that in the companies that I've talked to, but I think that would be a cool, really cool product. There used to be a product that would, so let's say a person applied to RuCCS for a particular role, and their features were evaluated as not being a good fit for the role. There was a company that was sort of pursuing we will now recommend you totally different jobs, including at some other companies, that would be a better fit based on the features you have. But that was shut down because for legal reasons there was a concern that you would be, if RuCCS offered that, they would be making representations about what another person or entity might want, which then they might not have endorsed.
I think there's a style of headhunter that does this implicitly, right? That they don't necessarily have industry knowledge so much as they have. I find they're really creative people for whatever version of industry you're in that needs a crazy creative person. I've seen a little bit of that. I wonder if it's the same experience.
Yeah, and maybe that's okay because it's an independent contractor who then gets to shuffle the people around. So yeah, I like that idea. That's cool.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Hi. So I'm basing this question off of what I've seen on social media. There's sometimes, especially if we talk about recruitment, there are some ads and all these, and I'm going to try them. So I don't know if they're fake or they actually work, but they tell you that this is how you can actually write your resume or print your CV like that, or present your qualifications with certain keywords or something that will actually help you pass through that initial AI filter, whatever it is that gets you to that second step, right? So how does it work on the other end? Then if I already know what you're, in whatever way possible, if I know that what your model is looking for, and that would increase my chances of getting selected or being highlighted every single time, does that sort of rig the model, like the whole?
Yeah, good. Okay, great. So when we're thinking about online advice that might help candidates sort of optimize their applications, we might split that, for my purposes, into two different activities. So one is kind of the 0 to 1 problem. Like, is the advice making it possible for your, let's say, resume to be evaluated at all? Because we know from the LinkedIn data that there are some people's resumes that don't parse, and so then they're just not being recommended, period. So I would probably be mostly concerned about this 0 to 1 gap. And so I think there might be a sense in which maybe employers or LinkedIn or other entities might have the obligation to do something that they're not currently doing, which would be to flag and tell the candidate, hey, just so you know, your resume is not readable. And so we can't recommend you for anything whatsoever. But then there's this secondary question, which is if we're now in the zone where we're at least a candidate for consideration for different opportunities, how do some candidates learning about these optimization strategies but not others affect their chances? I mean, obviously positively, but then is that fair to the other candidates? No. I mean, I think this is one among many instances where the uneven distribution of this information is a kind of unfairness. And so we can think about trying to level the playing field on that front, but we can also think about trying to split the importance of each of these separate tasks. So you can imagine that there's one world where every single person has to be able to get recommended by LinkedIn, and that makes that qualification problem way more important than if there are many different streams, some of which lower information candidates might be better at navigating than others.
I'm going to insert myself because I have the power and I can. We'll get to everyone on the list. But I wanted to ask about whether you think the algorithmic monoculture problem is unique to automated decision making, or whether a version of it occurs in human minds. So you might think like there are certain kinds of errors, cognitive illusions, or certain kinds of biases that are either universal or just like pretty widespread in a given community or given type of person making decisions. And so we'll get the same kind of decision homogeneity, maybe not quite as robustly, but we might still get some problematic decision homogeneity because of human cognitive errors. Do you think that's correct? And if so, like what are the differences between the human version and the automated version?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So my first thought is I would love to see data on this. But I think you're right to say there are some like very common tendencies. And then we might be curious. My hypothesis is that the algorithmic ability to be consistent is just so much higher that even if this is a common tendency in humans, it's not like a universal tendency in the way that an algorithm can make the same decision every single time. But we might still be concerned about it for these reasons. If we said, hey, in my story, we're kind of relying on a natural source of human variance and idiosyncrasy that maybe for some types of tasks just isn't present. And so it would be interesting to see what are these perhaps like, you were thinking more like cognitive sources of bias or less like social bias.
Yeah, because I guess for your kinds of cases, you want things that are relatively universal. So I was thinking like maybe certain kinds of heuristics or things like that that everyone tends to use.
Yeah. So, I mean, either now or later, maybe we could brainstorm about would those hit individual candidates? So it could be like we have a heuristic where we're much more likely to hire the third candidate we see because of recency bias. But it could be that different individuals are the third candidate on different instances, for example. So what I would be curious about is there one that is sort of like uniquely concentrated on certain individuals or small groups? Or is it like these are still unfair, but their unfairness sort of cycles through many different individuals?
That's super helpful. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you.
Was there a follow-up?
Oh no, I think I have the amplifies.
Yeah. Actually, you're next. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for the talk. I kind of had a version of Zoe's question over the second one, which is I was really kind of puzzling over why I should think like contractualism is the right way to think about this situation at all. It doesn't seem like the applicants are in a situation with contractors in any meaningful way. I'm not really trying to society or anything like that. Just think of the applicants like a pool of applicants. It doesn't seem like they're in a similar relationship with the employer, the particular employer. It seems like the natural response is to say something like, well, in society, the society for contractors, maybe like those contractors make decisions about these kinds of things. But my understanding of how typical views of contractualism supposed to work is like it's like way too fine-grained about the kind of rules that we might be positing here. Gosh, trying
trying to think about what contractors would agree on, it seems like we have to focus on really high-level stuff. So I guess I was just wanting to hear more about independent reasons for thinking why contractualism is the right way to go about this.
Yeah, totally. So I think you're right that many of the principles that contractualists talk about are at this very coarse-grained level. But I think when you start to get into the details of how people tend to flesh out their accounts, there are sort of these much more specific concrete consequences that come about as a result of having agreed to these more coarse-grained principles, given the way a particular society is set up. So the story, which I haven't filled in here, but which I was imagining, was more like, okay, we have the social contract. You know, we have our perhaps more coarse-grained like set of agreements, but then given the way our particular society is at a particular time, then we end up filling that contract in with these more specific details. And at that level of granularity, I think it would be reasonable for someone to say, hey, there's a low-cost alternative that doesn't, you know, impose basically any burden on the decision maker because I'm talking about switching between equal accuracy models. I do have the right to request that. Now, it might be that this is unpalatable because it's just too much interference in a process that many people want to be very unconstrained. And so I think we can definitely have the sort of the tussle at the level of, you know, how much should we be in the American model of employment versus the European model of employment versus like how should we conceptualize the obligations that an employer has to people that they haven't hired yet. But I think that's the level that maybe we have to have the fight on.
Michelle? Oh, or maybe is yours a follow-up?
A follow-up to your Catherine's reply.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. And then
So
Michelle.
you mentioned that with human biases, there's a recency and primacy type of bias, like whether you're first in the queue or last in the queue, you're remembered more. But for a computer system, I don't understand where this bias might occur. Right? Is it at the level of the programmer, or because computer systems don't have a privacy or recency bias? Right? Can you speak more about that?
Absolutely, I agree with you. So I think what I didn't explain well is that I was trying to respond to the part of Zoe's question where she was asking, is it possible that humans have cognitive biases of this kind that would rise to the level of homogenization or monoculture? So that was, I think I didn't flag that, but that was my example of a type of human bias or heuristic, but I was trying to suggest that it wouldn't have this outcome homogenization effect, although it might be bad for other reasons. Yeah, thank you.
Michelle.
I actually have two questions, and one is also a direct follow-up to Zoe's question. So the follow-up to Zoe's question is I'm wondering about, it got me thinking about like sort of systematic biases or whatever in humans. And the thing that I kept coming to is like related to advice that people get about CVs, right? Or applications and resumes in general. So something like if your CV is not formatted in some standardized way, right? There might be systematic discrimination where like the community of academics are going to look more poorly on that CV, even though the content may be identical to another one. But your response to Zoe was like about individuals, and that feels more like it's about the application and not the individual, right? Like the format of the CV is not inherent to the person. They can of course change it with every new job that they apply to in a way that like I can't change my name to not be Donald the next time I apply, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of feels, it feels like an irrelevant, although asterisks on that because you could argue it's not irrelevant, but like an irrelevant feature that might lead to homogenous discrimination, but also that's maybe like not inherent to the applicant. And so I guess I'm wondering how much that matters and your thought on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, good. So I think that's a really good example. So just as certain CVs might not be machine readable, there might be certain CVs that within a particular community or a particular job of interest are viewed as not fitting into the social norm of how we typically format these CVs. and then for that reason, they're systematically rejected. And so then I take it part of the question is that still a similar type of phenomenon, even though it's not an immutable characteristic of this person? Yeah, I mean, we could certainly think of variations of this that are, if not immutable, like unlikely to be changed characteristics of this person. Like, for example, if someone is an international student and went to a school that has a scoring system that a hiring committee or a job committee doesn't recognize, they might be, you know, like, I am 11.5 out of 12, and that's very good, but that might not be as salient to the hiring committee, and that might be a form of sort of traditional discrimination or overlooking. But here, I think you're right to say, well, we could also imagine, even if none of the content is changed, we could still have these sort of like social norms of formatting. I think it would be really interesting in a particular setting whether we would want to give that a class-based analysis or not. So would we want to say, like, that's just a particular type of social capital that that person doesn't have access to, and so like they're experiencing a class-based bias? But we might not, and then I think you're right that they would be similar. Yeah.
My second question is about so the cases here, the sort of issues with homogenization are about errors, and I'm wondering about error per se versus other kinds of like downsides of this whatever homogeneity approach. And the one example that you said like early in your talk as part of the sort of framing here that sort of stood out to me was sort of not keeping up with the market, and I sort of thought of that in the sense of like, you know, it's sort of old, like necessarily older training data than I currently have access to in my own mind, right? Because I'm like, you know, constantly updating in a way that these models are not. So I might like have information of what to look for or something, or there might be something that would be good for the job that is not going to be part of the training set or whatever. That's how I interpreted that example. And so I'm wondering if you have thought about other ways to change these algorithms or change these models that will address the other issues that aren't just sort of errors per se. Because that doesn't feel like an error to me, in the sense that it's not like it's sort of totally correct based on what it's learned. It's just that feature of a candidate or something was not previously valuable and it is now valuable. Right? So whether there's other ways we can change the algorithm to accommodate those cases.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so there might be two different kinds of activity that we might be interested in. So one, it might be, how can we achieve better optimality in the prediction task, which I think is what you're asking. Yeah. So like, there's a significant source of suboptimality, which is that, yeah, our training data is time indexed to, you know, whenever the last data point is, and yet time continues to move on like a terrifying stream that sweeps all of us in its path. And so it becomes out of date immediately, and that's very sad. Yeah, I agree with that. So you might think about the work of some of the people in this room on sort of online learning. So it's very common in the real systems that people actually use to do this like once a year. Maybe they'll update stuff at most. But that is missing out on a lot of information. And so you could imagine a world where you do have a continuous stream of updates. I think there are an enormous number of similar inefficiency things that you could do. For example, none of these systems that I'm aware of have a loop effect where they actually measure how good were the employees that were finally hired. So there isn't kind of like you might think that they would be improving their algorithms based on, we recommended this person and they turned out to be good or not so good or something, but that's actually not happening at all. So that seems like a missed opportunity, but obviously the market is not demanding that happen. But I guess I think those are all good things and should happen. I'm personally more interested in, I guess I think the optimality improvements will happen naturally. A case that I'm perhaps equally interested in is what if there just are a whole bunch of good candidates in some kind of bracket such that they're meaningfully indistinguishable from each other, but there are more candidates in that bracket than we intend to hire? Is there something that's kind of owed to those candidates or whatever? I don't know that we're always in the case where we're trying to eke out marginal improvements in choosing among those candidates. We might just be happy that we achieved that bracket.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about like more like an innovation-y type case where like someone might not even be in that bracket, but actually be the best candidate because of some novel thing that you need that had never been part of the decision criteria before.
Yeah.
And so, like in your case, you were like flipping things, flipping decisions of people that you're uncertain about, right? But I'm wondering about whether there would be any benefit in this particular case where innovation might be valuable of like flipping randomly some percentage of even ones you're pretty certain are bad or something, right? Just to like introduce, maybe in some systematic way, not in like, I don't know. But whether there's a way to like introduce innovation into these kinds of models.
Yeah, that's a great point. Right, because as you said at the beginning, like they are good only from the perspective of the criteria and the data that you're training them on. And so it might be that the world has changed so significantly that your old model is not actually tracking like what would make a candidate good in the current time step. And so maybe that's an argument, as you said, for flipping all the way down. So you could do that more or less depending on your tolerance for risk. But you could imagine the case where you give the 1% candidate a job 1% of the time, or maybe even more. Thank you.
I finished my list, but I think there are some hands I didn't catch. Is that a hand? Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Yeah, I was kind of curious. Sorry if I missed an example when you were talking about it on the slide. But I was thinking about how the examples of bias that I can remember being myself, a lot of them seemed tied to specific types of data or specific types of data sets that people are feeding into these models. But one of the other sources of homogenization or monoculture was over-reliance on the same type of model across tests or across systems. I was wondering if you could give an example of bias or a kind of systematic exclusion that would come about due to using a particular kind of model rather than being constrained or in terms of your data sets or using biased data, something more about the actual models themselves.
Yeah, totally. So I think we see this a lot with traditional group-based bias. So if a model has certain capacities or lack of capacities, like it's not very knowledgeable about particular topics that might be of interest to a subgroup, like LGBTQ people, maybe it doesn't like know a lot of things about interest they might have, or maybe is not very fluent at talking about those topics in a way that might be recognizable to that group. Or you could imagine there are different regional dialects, including like of the way that global English is spoken, and the model is better or worse at interacting in different global English dialects. You could imagine cases where whatever lack of capacity it has then appears in each of the products that it's used in. So whether it's used as a backend to Slack, or to a chatbot, or to analyzing a doctor's notes, all of those capacities might have the same issue. But maybe you had a different question.
No, I think that is addressing the question I asked.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if even in those examples what we're saying then is a shortcoming of that kind of a hypothetical model would be that has a deficiency that either excludes certain kinds of data from the data that it's considering, or else makes it inefficient at, would you say, like in handling those different kinds of data?
Yeah, but even if that model had been originally trained, let's say, on a subset of data about that language group or language speaker dialect that is proportional to their occurrence in the population, if that group is small, it's just not going to learn that much. And so its central tendency is still going to be very much the tendency that accords with most of the data. Because if if you think about the task that these large language models are asked to do, they're asked to collapse this much data into still a really big model, but a huge subset of the model size is much smaller than the data size. And so if you're collapsing something, you are going to lose the margins. Yeah.
Just a clarification about the whether or not, just like think about the core example of like me submitting 3 applications to 3 different grocery stores. On the kind of technology that's being implemented here, would it be actually the case that I'd get like the same resume score each time? Because it seemed like the initial talk was like input-output systems. Like I totally would get it if it was just like a function, but I guess my understanding was like, even if it's making the same type of errors, it's not the case that like each time I put the same token in, I'd get the same exact error. So I guess I was just, would it be the case that I would get denied like I get the same score in the 3 different cases when using these things?
Yeah, I think it really depends.
Okay.
So one system that is pretty widely used is called Pymetrics. And there, each of us as candidates would take a suite of 16 cognitive games. So we would be like popping balloons at a certain point to see what our tolerance for risk is, or we would be playing the caterpillar game or whatever. But the scores we would get on those tests would be the only scores we would have for 330 days. And so we can't have new scores. So then the question is just, how does each grocery store's custom model weight those features that have been learned from this suite of games, given that my features are static? And so there it might depend on, are all 3 grocery stores using Pymetrics sort of house grocery store model or house customer service model, in which case it would be mechanically the same. Or has each of them paid extra to have their special grocery store model, in which case we might wonder if they're each training on 50 of their customer service employees, how similar are their features to each other? That is going to strongly determine whether I can get through. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I guess I was just asking whether like the models were deterministic or probabilistic in nature.
They're deterministic,
Okay.
but they might each have a slightly different SVM.
Okay.
All right, thanks everyone for the great discussion. Let's thank Dr. Creel. Please join us for a reception and some snacks over at RuCCS.
Thanks, everybody.